Welcome to another edition of Reaching Out. I'm Gregory Floyd, President, Local 237 Teamsters. With us is a very special guest, retired Supreme Court Justice Matthew Cooper. Matthew Cooper was elected to the Civil Court in 2000. He was also elected on the Supreme Court in 2010. While in the Supreme Court, he also served on the Appellate Court. He had cases involving retirement, divorce, many celebrity, high-profile cases, wrote numerous decisions on issues such as joint child custody, divorce summonses, Facebook, change the law, pet custody, and vaccination requirements. He's a frequent lecturer at law schools. He's active in judicial organizations to promote welfare. And I also must say, his grandmother was a lawyer who graduated from NYU Law School in 1922, following in his grandmother's footsteps. While doing all that, his previous career, he served as the Director of Legal Services for DC 37 and Local 237 Teamsters, and that's where I met Matt Cooper 27 years ago. Matthew, affectionately known as Matt Cooper, welcome to Reaching Out and congratulations on your retirement.
Thank you, Greg, and it's terrific to be here with you, now President Floyd. When we worked together back in Local 237, I think I first met you as a
Deputy
shop
Director.
steward.
Yeah,
Yes, Director.
Deputy Director, yes.
Right, and both of us went upwards and onwards, but as I've told you many times, one of the most formative experiences of my life, most valuable experience I had, was leading the legal services plan at that great Local 237.
Thank you, and I appreciate your counsel. And something that you said to me, full disclosure, when my wife Wendy and I bought our house, Matthew was our attorney, because Local 237 provides attorneys to close houses, and he was our attorney. And we had some difficulty with the seller. And I remember Matthew told me something, and I coined it, I used it, and today is still good advice. He said, Greg, there's two ways to handle this. I could be a real hard guy and go after these people, or we could be patient, diplomacy, and wait. And he said, I got to tell you, if I'm going to be hard, I got to be really good. And I remember that. So in order to be hard, you have to be really good. So patience is always a virtue. Whenever I see people, unless you're on the basketball court and you're Michael Jordan, LeBron James, those guys can afford to be hard. Everybody else falls in line. They have to be patient. So understanding that lesson, you helped shape my career and some of my thought process. Thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thanks, Greg. Great to hear that.
Yes. So working people are put at a disadvantage when dealing with the legal system, and how union legal service helped them overcome the disadvantages. Can you tell us about that portion of your career?
Absolutely, Greg. So before I became a lawyer, I went into something called VISTA, which was Volunteers in Service to America. That's after I came out of college. I was sent to a legal services plan up in the South Bronx, where I helped people with all kinds of problems, mainly concerning welfare benefits and landlord-tenant issues. That experience was so great, it prompted me to go off to law school. But before I went to law school, I did a little work at a new legal services plan. It was a new idea that both DC 37 had come up with. Also at the same time, Local 237 basically was doing the same thing. The leadership at both those unions said, hey, our city workers don't get to be represented in law, in legal matters. Poor people get legal services. Rich people can afford to hire attorneys, but where does that leave the working person? And when I came back from law school, I went to an experimental law school, Antioch, which stressed real urban urban, down to the earth, regular, dealing with real people law. I went back to DC 37. Then I was there for 10 years doing and ended up being the head of the housing court unit. And then fortunately, I got a call from Carl Haynes, who was then vice president of Local 237. He wanted somebody, he and the then president Barry Feinstein wanted somebody to take over the legal services plan. I did that. And that's through that experience, I realized that people who would not be able to get legal services otherwise, would have to go to housing court, would have to go to bankruptcy court, would have to go defend in debt cases, or as I later spent a lot of my career as a judge doing, would have to be involved in one of the most painful experiences in life, divorces. They were able to have lawyers. And that was a sea change for people, for their lives, because going to court unrepresented always leaves you at a big disadvantage. Having to borrow money and mortgage your house to be able to afford a lawyer leaves you at a big disadvantage. But with the great lawyers you have now, you continue to have a Local 237, that puts people on equal footing. So that is, I think, one of the most significant things that unions like yours have done, Greg, giving people not only medical, you don't even get just medical benefits, you don't get all the other benefits you get being a union member, but you get lawyers when you need them for issues in everyday life.
Thank you. And you were the first legal director of the Local 237 Welfare Fund, weren't you?
I was not the first. There'd been a series of people had come and gone. It wasn't really, but somehow when I came on, there was a real push to make it one of the best legal services plan in the state. And so I benefited from that, from full support of the union. And basically some of the people who I hired, I know some of the people I hired are still there. It's because it's not just a job. It is basically, it's a mission to represent working people. Even used to tell our lawyers, and even when our clients might not have been in the right, that happens when you represent people. They still deserve to be represented. Everybody should have equal access to the courts. And that's what Local 237 Legal Services does. Puts them on the same level as other people who might be able to afford legal services, or other people who have government legal services defending them.
You mentioned earlier about divorce. Can you tell us about the financial impact divorce has on working people?
Yeah, so Greg, what I did after I became just a little background, and I was at DC 37, then I came to Local 237 as a director and stayed there for 12 years. But for some reason, I always wanted to be a judge. Not quite sure why. I tell you, both my grandparents on one side, including my grandmother, had been lawyers. And so it was sort of in my blood. Skipped a generation. Neither my mother nor my father were lawyers. They were teachers. I then became a lawyer after my experience being a VISTA volunteer up in the South Bronx. And it was a great, 20 years I practiced law. But I always wanted to, when I used to go to court with our members, I would say to myself, I think I could do a better job than that person up on the bench. And I would say, time may come to prove it. And it was one of the great things about being at Local 237 when it came time for me to enter the political process. Local 237 was there for me. And in fact, the final vote where all the district leaders came together to endorse a candidate for civil court, where did it take place? The ground floor at 216 West 14th Street. So yes. Surrounded by all those pictures of all our workers putting on the horseshoes and being at the housing authority and doing their school safety work. So I started as civil court. We spent a few years in criminal court. And then eventually went to the Supreme Court, was elected, and remember in New York, Supreme Court, unlike other states, is the highest trial court. It's not the highest court in the state. Highest court is the Court of Appeals. So I was doing cases involving the city of New York, had a few cases actually that had unions and were represented by lots of lawyers, But I got a call from the administrative judges then, and she said, Matthew, we don't have a man in our matrimonial part. It's been a long time. How do you feel about doing that? And the way I worked in the court system, they asked you to do something, you do it. But I felt like doing it anyway, because one of the mainstays of our practice at Local 237 was representing people in divorces. And they were particularly difficult divorces in many ways, because we didn't have people with huge amounts of money. Yeah, they had gentlemen could have a house, could have an apartment, could have good pension, but the divorce would take a real impact on them, because as we all know, it's really expensive when you go from 2 salaries to 1, when you have to deal with the issue of child support. You're not making hundreds of thousands. You're a working person making 40, 50, 60, $70,000. That money only goes so far in New York City. So once I got this opportunity to go off and be a divorce judge, I made a vow, which I'm pretty sure I kept. And it was hard sometimes, but it was, no matter how famous the people coming in on other cases, no matter how multi-million dollars their income were, how many houses they were, I wanted to give as much time to people who had less, because dividing less often is harder, and it often has even more significant ramifications. So when you ask, Greg, what's the impact that a divorce has on working people, it's significant, because let's say you live in a housing authority apartment, or let's say you live in a rent stabilized apartment or a middle income co-op in New York City. Divorce comes, only one party, either the husband or the wife, is going to get the apartment. And the person that is going to be out of the apartment may have a really difficult time finding somewhere to live, because we all know how much it costs to live in New York City. So the stakes are really high, and the impact is great. So I was able to use that experience as when I was on the bench, and I just retired as of December 31st, but I stayed in the matrimonial part for 12 years. I was able to use that experience to always keep in mind the stakes will get even higher when there's less to divide. And hopefully that we were able to come up, I always look to come up with a resolution. The worst way for a case to end up is the trial, but hoping the parties would settle and come up where both sides come out with enough and live a decent life, although no longer married to one another.
You're listening to Reaching Out. I'm Gregory Floyd, President Local 237 Teamsters. With us, a very special guest, retired Supreme Court Justice Matthew Cooper. Can you talk to us a little bit about the changes of divorce law, and also the changing role of divorced single fathers?
That's a great question, Greg. And I tell you, it's something in the 12 years that I had the privilege of sitting in a matrimonial part in New York Supreme down in 60 Center Street, the courthouse with the big pillars, the one that Law and Order is filmed at.
Yes.
I got to see some amazing changes. When I first started, New York was the last state that needed grounds for divorce. You had to come up with a reason to get divorced. It couldn't just be the parties no longer loved each other and didn't want to live together. In fact, when I was at Local 237, I had a trial for someone who wanted to get divorced, and the divorce was denied. And then ultimately, he had to move to another state in order to get divorced. So it's weird. You would think that New York would be the most progressive. Wasn't. I wrote a decision about that, and a number of months later, finally we had divorce reform, and then the law changed. And so basically, fault was no longer an issue. It was simply irretrievable breakdown of the marriage was enough to get the divorce itself. But of course, then you had to deal with all the other financial issues. And one of the big changes in law that has taken place, it started before I became a divorce lawyer, a divorce judge, but it happened while I was a practicing attorney. So at one time, property went to the party in whose name it was titled. That changed with something called equitable distribution. So you don't evenly divide the property, you divide it equitably based on people's contributions. There were lots of other changes too. The way you could commence a divorce action used to be, you almost had to always put it in a person's hand. You know, they always see those movies where the process server is running around trying to put it in the hand. You mentioned Facebook. I had a decision where I allowed the wife, in this case, to serve the husband by a Facebook posting because there was no other way to reach him. That was known as I think the press gave that, you've got mail, you're being divorced. Okay, so one of the major things, though, that has changed, and I saw this a lot in 237, back when I was head of legal services, I guess we probably had more men in the union. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but we tend to very often in divorces or in family court cases, we'd be representing the father. And there was sort of a feeling, well, no, yeah, the father just gets weekends access, maybe every other weekend and a weeknight. That's really changed, Greg. There is now, it's clearly, at least in the New York and certainly in the metropolitan area, that if not a presumption that there'll be equal time, is more of that thought is there that both parents should have the same access to their children, and the children have the same access to both parents. So it used to be fathers came way behind, number two to mothers in when you deal with these issues of custody. That's no longer the case. Both parents. And so it's one of the great things I've seen, fathers really, really becoming involved, even when divorced or when there's a breakup in a marriage where there wasn't a breakup in a relationship when there wasn't a marriage, really staying involved in their children's lives. And that wasn't always what happened in the past. So I see that as one of the really encouraging things to have happened in our society.
So tell us how working as the legal service director of Local 237 and also DC 37 prepared you for your role as a Supreme Court judge.
And what it did, and I've loved lots of great colleagues became judges who are different routes. Some by just being in the court system, being court attorneys, to the work being a law clerk to judges. Others who came from big law firms. I had a different approach. I had a different training and a different experience. My experience was so much rooted in reality. It was of regular people. And that's something we often lose sight of. Everyone pays such close attention, they should, to these major decisions from the United States Supreme Court. Everybody pays such close attention they should to major decisions from our major appeals court. But when it comes down to it, what affects regular people, your neighbors, my neighbors, are things like divorces, family court disputes, landlord-tenant issues, debt cases, buying and selling real estate and disputes come out of that. Because those are like the things and criminal cases, because we like to think, oh, I'm never going to be dealing with a criminal case until you get arrested for maybe doing something that wasn't a crime. You don't think you'll ever be involved in the criminal justice system. But these are the sort of things that affect everyday people. And at DC 37, and especially at Local 237, where I spent so much time, I got to see how the legal system affected the lives of regular working people. And I think I always was able to keep that in my mind and in my heart as I sat as a judge, that sometimes, and I had some of my divorces were giant. I mean, there were people who made hundreds of millions of dollars. A lot of them, because it's Manhattan, were some famous celebrities. I had a number of big movie stars, lots of people. Yeah, and that's fun and exciting and interesting. But I very much think I certainly hope. Now, I'm confident I never lost sight of everybody else's case, the person who nobody's heard of, the person who has a job where they make $40,000, $50,000 a year, the person who's coming off doing the work that kept our city going during COVID, has always kept our cities going. Their disputes are just as important. And that's what I try to keep my focus on. Equal time for everybody, treating every case as important as the next case, irrespective if that person is not famous, irrespective if that person isn't a multimillionaire. Regular people are the people I represented at DC 37 and Local 237. And the lesson I got from that was how important every decision made in the legal system can be on the way they lead their lives.
Now, how has the pandemic affected the court system?
Yeah, so one of the things I guess probably it helped prompt me to decide might be time to retire. I love had a great run. That is going to have a major effect on the court system. Judges come and go. But for me personally, it was a great run. Hey, Greg, how many football players or basketball players have we seen who should have exited a little before they did, right?
Yeah, it happens. Yeah.
I decided, I think I'm going to try to leave at the top. But one of the things that sort of prompted me to do that was there's been a turn towards doing everything virtually, and which is great in many ways, but it's kind of hard for someone like me who's so used to having a courtroom and having people in it. The same way it's probably going to be tough. I don't know how you did your negotiations, if you did them in person or virtually. It's a change. So the virtual mode has a lot of benefits. So you don't have to have a judge, you don't have to have a lawyer come in hours and hours and hours for a 20-minute court appearance. You can do it virtually, but it's kind of hard. It's harder to size up the people because you're not doing it personally. You're not being able to look them in the eye the same way. It's hard to do shuttle diplomacy where it bring one side in, one side out, back and forth. Trials, I think a little more difficult because you don't really see the same sort of body language. But with all that said, it's kind of remarkable that we kept the court system going the way we did, because people like me who had never done anything, had never done, what do they call Skype? I never done a Skype call. And all of a sudden, there I was, hearing cases. And so one of the great events, and then I was thinking about this, one day I was doing a case, and I guess the wife was at a house she has upstate New York. And I said, I'm about to say something that I don't think has ever been said in a court proceeding in New York County. And what I'm going to say now is, ma'am, can you do something about quieting down that rooster in the background? Because it was, and then she said, okay, would someone go out and put the rooster to the other side of the yard? The stuff that it was, so it's a different way, but just think about how much, in 2 years, that's the transformation, as I say, kind of from the Flintstones to the Jetsons, and without missing a beat. So right. For someone like me, it's been around a while, the transition was harder. I made it. Would I have been happier to continue with a big crowded courtroom with lots of people there? Yeah, I would have. But we did the best we could.
Thank you. And Matt, I see we're coming up on less than a minute. Is there anything you'd like to say before we end the interview?
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. I want to say this is like one of the first things I've done since I've been retired, and this is a real highlight. It is so good to be back with you. I mean, we had one of the things about being a Local 237 and then running the legal services plan, we were part of the union. We were part of with the same mission, make our members' lives as good as they could possibly be. So it's just a really honor to be back here. And I keep hearing great things about what your attorneys down there, led by Mary Sheridan, the director. And when they appeared before me, because there are a lot of divorce cases where Local 236 would come in, I always knew that those members were going to be as represented, as good as anybody could be represented. that made my job as a judge so much easier. And it certainly made the lives of your members that much better.
Thank you. And that's all the time we have for this edition of Reaching Out. A very special guest, retired Justice Matt Cooper, New York State Supreme Court. Matt, thank you for laying the foundation for Local 237's members and legal services. And we really appreciate the work that you've done over the years for both the members of Local 237 and the people of New York State. Thank you very much.
Thank you.